Chanel is easily one of the most impactful privately owned companies in fashion today. One of the last ones to exist, in fact. That's because the family behind it knew how to navigate true hardships over the last about 120 years. So today, as we enter a new chapter of Chanel under Matthieu Blazy, let's look back on exactly how Chanel became Chanel. This video is a shortened version of my second ever book. Weirdly, I think it's the first book ever written as a biography of the Chanel company directly instead of about Chanel personally, so it's well worth the read in my opinion. So the link for that is in the description box below. I do know Amazon sucks, but considering the point of my channel is to make it so reliable fashion information is indefinitely publicly available, then that's the best solution that I have to that problem. Alternatively, I do have the book for sale on my Patreon as a digital copy, and you don't need to be a member of the Patreon to buy there. I hope you enjoy it, and please do send me photos on Instagram because I loved that last time. The Chanel business began as a milliner's in 1908 in her lover's brother's bachelor apartment at 160 Boulevard Malesherbes. It was quite an informal affair because her lover, Etienne Barsin, who was funding the venture, did not wholeheartedly believe in it, as it was quite taboo for a wealthy man's mistress to have a business at this time. For this reason, when another even wealthier man by the name of Arthur Capel offered to expand the business to his own apartment on Boulevard Malesherbes in 1909, Chanel jumped at the chance. This is often when it's stated that Chanel was founded, as it is in 1909 when the business was established as Chanel Mode, despite the fact that she was already selling hats the previous year in 1908. One thing you should know about this time, however, is that Chanel could not sew almost at all. She could embroider small things, but that was pretty much it, and she wasn't an expert even at that. It was this that led to her minimal style, and it was not naturally popular. Both of her lovers, Capel and Balsin, sent their wealthy female friends to buy hats from her, seemingly out of duty, more so than because these minimal hats were well designed, because by all accounts, they were not. In fact, more than one author points out that these were simple hat bases bought from Galeries Lafayette with a simple ribbon attached. So, in comparison to other hats of the time, which I'll put an example on the screen, it's likely they just read as lazy as opposed to minimal, and the only customers that she had were there for duty rather than for fashion. Because of this, Chanel Mode was very, very far from profitable, even after a Chanel hat was shot for the cover of Comédie Illustrée magazine. In fact, Capel wrote several times how he only kept the business open in order to keep his mistress happy. By all accounts, her skill in fashion was never design or sewing at all, but in social climbing. And that's most obvious at this time. Because despite her hats losing him money hand over fist, Chanel had a team of workers, and she even requested to expand the business. And expand they did. By 1910, Chanel hired her younger sister Antoinette to be a shop assistant, an up-and-coming milliner named Lucien Rabatte to both design and construct the hats, two more assistants who came with Rabatte from her previous employer Maison Louis, and finally, but still in 1910, she would set up shop on 21 Rue Cambon. Quickly, it became clear to Rabatte, who herself went on to be a successful milliner, that the move to Chanel was a mistake. Chanel had truly no ability in millinery whatsoever. Cheney, in her 2012 book, goes as far as to call it an ignorance of technique, and it caused major arguments within the salon. Chanel would request a hat, they would make it, but because it didn't look like how she thought she described, Chanel would become irate and abuse her staff. She'd even refuse to help any customers within the shop, leaving when they came in. Frankly, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Chanel was an awful boss to the people in her salon, and she doesn't seem to have been well respected by them in technique either, because her ignorance had caused so many internal problems. All in all, there was really only one positive about Chanel Mode at this time, and that's the fact that she saw her business as a capitalist venture first and foremost, really pushing to make it profitable by purposefully keeping the prices high while limiting the amount of endowment that went on them. It's a tactic she would literally physically write down in one of the very few notes that she ever wrote, so we do know that this was an intentional tactic, and it is unusual she would write down because she was nearly illiterate, but it did evidence that she had a natural flair for retailing, and in the end, that was her skill. This is the real reason for her success, not the idea that she was some genius designer as we all have the perception of today. She even personally later dictated in her memoir, "Fashion is not an art, it is a job. If art makes use of fashion, then that is sufficient praise. It's best to follow fashion, even if it's ugly." That said, Chanel's company was still hemorrhaging Kappel's finances, and by 1911, 1912-ish, she still wanted to expand. Fortunately, Kappel had enough money not to worry too much about the losses, and from his notes saved in his own memoir, it seems more that he was just humoring her more than anything else. His mistress wanted a job, and he didn't mind defying social norms at the time to allow her this hobby. Their expansion came eventually in this 1912-ish time, in which she would loophole the licensing on her 21 Rue Cambon address by selling knitwear and jerseys. So the licensing on her place did not allow her to compete with the dressmakers or couturiers nearby. So she could not herself sell couture, but jersey was such a poor fabric that it was inconceivable anyone would sell it on the prestigious Rue Cambon, especially in the mass-produced manner that Chanel had commissioned. It literally just circumvented the licensing limitation. It was almost as if H&M opened up on Fifth Avenue, which I don't live in New York, I have no idea if they've already done that. Also, I know this sounds a bit harsh, but it was actually more accurate than you might believe, as nearly all of Chanel's clothes at this time were heavily inspired by other designers of the time, mostly Paul Poiret, who she adamantly never credited, and Madeleine Vianney, who she did. In fact, the earliest recorded Chanel dress is this one from 1913, and it's apparently a near dupe of a Vianney dress, which is a little ironic because if you've watched my Vianney video, you know how extremely adamant Vianney was against copying. Chanel, however, would later encourage copyists greatly, but we will get to that. For now, just know that she had hopes to expand into couture, but was currently selling sportswear, and frankly, it did not suit her Rue Cambon location. So she moved. She opened up a second location in 1913 in Deauville on the coast of France, hiring 2 more local women as seamstresses and naming the first store Gabrielle Chanel. Women were on the trend of engaging in more sporting activities, mostly conducted in seaside towns, and they were underrepresented in local stores. By which, I mean she was extremely far from the first designer to produce sporting clothes, several years late in fact, but she was an early adopter of the trend in Deauville specifically, where she knew wealthy people holidayed in the summer. Here, taking inspiration from menswear, Chanel ordered her seamstresses to create open-collar blouses, belted jackets, long skirts, fisherman shirts, turtlenecks, oversized jumpers, and polo sweaters with slight tweaks to make them appropriate for women. These designs too are widely considered to be dupes, which we know thanks to both of Carmel Snow's autobiographies. Yes, I did an incredible amount of reading for this project, thank you for noticing, because Carmel Snow notes explicitly that Chanel's designs were, quote, simplifications of Cherie, who was the first female designer to head a major couture house. She goes into more detail about this too, by which I mean Carmel Snow goes into more detail about this too, explaining how Chanel was producing them on a mass scale, which to be fair is nothing like we would consider mass market today, but it does explain that that was the selling point. These were easy to pick up off the shelf and buy. Also, a huge selling factor was Chanel herself as a person, who, though she wasn't accepted by high society at this time, just because of the way social hierarchy was set up, did actually have a gravitas to her. Chanel had never been afraid of selling to courtesans, which many of the designers at the time were, and as a mistress herself, it became almost a sexual intrigue that drew women into her shop. She used this too. Chanel was well aware that she was selling herself as much as she was selling her clothes, and she purposefully perpetuated this by trying to be seen with her hands in her pockets, which at the time was a sign of lesbianism. This, mixed with her openly bisexual affairs with women, made her quite exciting to know and made people want to go into the shop. Remember that Diesel advert that was like, sex sells, unfortunately we sell jeans? That's basically what she was doing. With that said, business was still a slow drip over time as the locals and people who were holidaying there got to know Chanel and got to be intrigued by her. Therefore, business didn't really pick up until the outbreak of World War I in 1914, which saw about a third of Paris migrate to Deauville, where they both needed to be clothed and were further intrigued by Chanel. Because of that, because of the war breaking out and Chanel happening to be there, they finally turned a profit. 200,000 gold francs, the equivalent of 800,000 pounds, 900,000 euros, or about $1 million. Finally, it was actually worthwhile for a couple to finance the expansion of Chanel. They decided on yet another prime location, this time in a massive building called La Villa Larolde on Rue Gardère in Biarritz, and it was to be her first couture studio. Opening 1915, Chanel's couture studio was not really what you would think of as couture today. It still had a lot of mass-produced elements to it, in part because it was during World War I, and in part because there were few petits mains to hire because they were in World War I. But it was successful, and it led to her first official collection, which was called La Pauvreté de Luxe, which debuted in 1916, a frankly genius introduction to her brand, which was known for using very cheap fabrics like jersey and putting them with luxury elements like silk linings. It well branded her business, and it allowed her to continue to use the high margin strategy that she'd coined all the way back in 1908/1909 with her millinery work. For this reason, the couture business was flooded with orders from the first day it opened. Antoinette, who'd come over to help, took orders from all over the world, and the 300-odd seamstresses were working as fast as they could. They even had to send their première, Marie-Louise Delay, to Spain to set up an atelier to meet the needs of their Spanish clients. Interestingly, this is also the first time in her entire company's history that it's really explicit that Chanel was doing the design work. Despite Marie-Louise Delay saying Chanel, quote, never set foot in the workrooms and only working until 2 or 3 in the afternoon, after which she, quote, retired to her drawing room where she entertained a great deal, she is finally described as calling them on the phone to describe her designs. She also chose colors, laces, and ornaments for the petit mains to actually sew together. Though Marie-Louise did later admit that they had to heavily interpret what Chanel dictated because of her lack of technique, meant that without interpretation it was impossible to make a wearable garment. With that said, though Chanel's debut was a very obvious success, by that November, the same year, her clients were already a bit tired of her design ethos. Quote, in November 1916, Vogue gave a hint of impatience that Gabrielle's apparently limitless capacity to design using the previously down-market jersey was clearly not shared by readers, when it informed that it had been rumoured lately that women were growing tired of jersey. But Chanel is a master of her art, and her jersey frocks are as complete and as daintily finished as frocks of more thoroughly patrician stuffs. You can probably tell Vogue already had a personal relationship with Chanel by this point, as they were defending her so greatly in this. But that really was only part of the problem. It was also somewhat considered unpatriotic to start a business during the wartime, as most of her contemporaries had shut shop to help out with war efforts. The fact that her business grew due to the lack of competition was well criticized at the time, and she was not the only female couturier. Personally, I also think Chanel's refusal to personalize her original designs, which was the norm in couture at the time, fed into it. Her prospective customers were used to customizable couture and the choice of many houses. But now Chanel was one of the only open design houses, and she had begun to force her customers to literally wear the same thing as one another, stubbornly refusing any changes on her designs. It would have affected consumer perspective. The saving grace to this, however, was her social standing. Quote, she had recognized that in order to acquire a greater reputation than her fellow designers, she would be wise to cultivate the impression that she didn't need to work hard, that, by implication, she was the equal of her clients. this in fact would be a tactic she used for the entire rest of her career. Chanel's growth in that case is a mixed bag throughout the 1910s and the 1920s. A lot of what we think of Chanel representing at this time today, the reasons why we think her business grew, is more like a modern day reframing. For example, many people believe that Chanel rid women of the corset. She did not. She sold corsets from 1915 onwards, and in fact was quite widely criticized at that time for the perpetuation that only skinny women could be fashionable, which had never been the case in fashion before. Quote, in 1923, Vogue described the hours one poor woman spent at the gym and the masseuse and the pills and rubber girdles used to attain an ideal shape. Another article would say how seductive is the straight line of our winter dresses, how revealing of the svelteness of the female silhouette, but then admitted that this was pretty much impossible to acquire without some kind of corset. There was no other way of achieving that desired silhouette. In that sense, Chanel's ethos was more about the appearance of liberation than actually liberating women. That said, despite the pushback, Chanel's designs were still selling fairly well. In September 1919, they finally expanded into their famed Paris location at 31 Rue Cambon. But then tragedy struck. Her financier, who was now in a relationship with a new lady who was his fiancé, Arthur Capel, died in a quite gruesome car accident, leaving her a large sum of money in his will. By 1920, they opened a Russian subsidiary thanks to her new friend and kind of lover, Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, who introduced her to Ernest Beau, the famed perfumer to the ex-Tsar of Russia. This is the man who would develop Chanel No. 5, which debuted in 1921. Of course, I go over it in the book in so much more detail because it's really fascinating, but I do also have a kind of old Chanel cosmetics video on underskin. So for brevity, I'll send you that way if you want to know more about the Chanel No. 5 fragrance and how impactful it was to the business. Because in the meantime, 1921 to 1922, Chanel's designs were gaining traction extremely quickly. Chanel was repetitive, but for the first time, critics loved it. They were amazed at Chanel's ability to be consistent without being monotonous in her minimalist designs, which had notably now become more popular than any of her competitors. Chanel did not sew, but she had honed an exceptional talent for world building and community building in which society ladies would want to wear Chanel at all times of day and night in order to feel included in this cultural phenomenon. This, in fact, is what led to the popularity of Chanel's little black dress, which I do feel like we probably should talk about despite the fact that it was kind of an accident. You see, it's a bit hard to say when the first little black dress was designed because we don't really know when it began. She could have commissioned the first one even before she had a business. In fact, it's not without the realm of possibility. Obviously, though, she was not the first to make a black dress, nor was she the first to make a little dress, nor was she the first to make a little black dress or make a night-to-day dress. So the idea of the little black dress is hard to pin down who first designed one, you know? What we do know is that in 1924 to 1926, she openly encouraged other designers and department stores, etc., to steal the design that she had made, all of them. And this is what led to it getting the nickname of the Ford dress, because it was so common by 1924-1926 that it contrasted people like Vianney, who really fought against the copyists. Effectively, the dress became famous because she allowed other people to copy her work. Weirdly, this is how this next era of Chanel would continue. Chanel never invented any one specific piece of clothing or accessory. Instead, she was better known for popularizing already existing styles because she herself had that je ne sais quoi that literally no one else had at that time. It's this that led to Chanel No. 5 a few years ago, her popularizing the bob haircut in France, and also led her to start a costume jewelry line in 1926, which popularized the idea of wearing fake jewelry proudly. She even went as far to make impossibly large pearls to capitalize on this democratized ethos. Quote, "It's disgusting to walk around with millions around the neck because one happens to be rich. I only like fake jewelry because it's provocative. Frankly, this was her genius. It's a rather modern concept even today to take designs that were current and just popularize them purely from how gravitational and influential she was in the haute monde. There's many designers that do this now, shan't name names, but undoubtedly her customers were buying from Chanel for the name of Chanel rather than the actual design credibility. Of course, this branding concept as well was not originated by her, but it was still a very novel concept at the time that she profited from, especially starting 1929 when the Great Depression hit. Many of her new friends she was introduced to through Capel lost their fortunes overnight. While Chanel was flush with new money, the women that had once looked down on her now needed to work. And Chanel saw it as an opportunity. Chanel was one of the very few places that these high society ladies could work without shame thanks to her own public stature, which had grown in recent years. Frankly, her decision to appear not to work for so many years had now led her to becoming more equal to these old money individuals, which then led her to being one of the few places for them to work. In return, Chanel gained an army of society ambassadors, further pushing her brand into the world of the haute monde. It was an invaluable promotion for Chanel, getting them accepted by royal and political connections alike. Because now that they were not flush with money because of the Great Depression, it too helped that with a Chanel ensemble, one could pretty much guarantee longevity in style, as she was known to be so consistent. And because of that consistency, it projected an ability to wear the world's most popular designer without the need to show off with excessive decoration. Effectively, she had the perfect blend for a major economic downturn. She had turned Chanel from being the H&M of Paris to being a brand for high-class people, endorsed by high-class people. It was an incredible turnaround. But it wasn't quite the easy transition she had made it out to seem. You see, despite another of her lovers, the Duke of Westminster, paying to expand Chanel in London into a store on Davy Street in Mayfair in 1928, and despite how famous Chanel had become in this time, it's widely believed that again by 1930, Chanel apparel was no longer doing as well as it had been. She even had to take external projects exclusively for the money, including all of her Hollywood work, none of which was successful, and all of which she hated to do. But in fairness, in this time, the slip in profits wasn't solely able to be blamed on Chanel herself. Yes, her unchanging style was falling out of fashion thanks to the rise of Schiaparelli, who I have 2 videos on, but it's also easily partially attributed to the sales slump during the Great Depression, which followed World War I, in which many of her contemporaries, including Poiret, had gone bust. Largely, it's believed too that Chanel would have also gone under in this time if it wasn't for her perfume, hence why it's believed to be the reason that she tried so hard to sue the Wertheimer family, who did own her perfume business. Or at least they owned 70% of it, but I'll just put the percents on the screen. While I say this, it's well worth pointing out that Schiaparelli really did have a profound effect on the Chanel business. Schiaparelli had all of the cool factor of Chanel, but Schiaparelli had a title. She was a baroness by marriage and from serious family wealth. Jealous, Chanel started to hit out publicly to Schiaparelli right from her debut in 1921, but because Scap never hit back, it ended up with Chanel just looking really cruel, dramatically affecting her public perception. Frankly, from here, people started to dislike Chanel, and by 1928, it was unignorable. Chanel had now been exposed for her social climbing ways, with peers noting that she was only particularly graceful or kind when she could get something from that person, while in the same breath was horrendously cruel to staff and or people she saw as beneath her. Even really influential people like Edna Woolman Chase, who was one of the heads of Condé Nast, for her book Always in Vogue, described Chanel as her Christian moments were sporadic. Chanel was now openly an arrogant person with an obvious superiority complex that had been well recorded for years before it came to affect her business. But she had a plan. In 1932, she staged a charity show in London, encouraging copyists to steal her designs. She continued to believe that if everyone was wearing the same thing, then there would be value in the original. It worked to an extent, but unfortunately nowhere near as well as she had hoped, and she still retained a rather negative public image. Considering Chanel was still made popular by Chanel's personal popularity, it really affected both companies, fashion and fragrance. By 1933, she was voted out as president of La Société des Parfums Chanel. She of course still owned her 10%, they couldn't get rid of that, but she no longer had any control in the company whatsoever. She was furious. By 1934, Chanel was interpreting Schiaparelli's designs into her own, both in couture, in oversized bows and heavy shoulder pads, and in her jewelry, including the 1932 haute jewelry collection called Bijoux de Diamant, which was inspired by the stars, which is Schiaparelli's most famous motif. To reiterate her own memoir, quote, "It's best to follow fashion, even if it's ugly." Chanel was defeated. So, when she returned to Paris in 1936 after some time away, to find that her workers were on strike, she could not contain how incredibly angry she was. They had become part of the nationwide workers' strikes in France, calling for things like increased wages, allowance to unionize, a 40-hour work week, and 2 weeks paid holiday. But despite the fact that this was a nationwide workers' strike, Chanel felt personally victimized and blamed their new Jewish president. She fired 300 workers on the spot, just shy of 10% of her workforce. As a result, she didn't have enough workers left to complete her autumn 1936 collection and was forced to apologize to as many of them as she could and return them to work. It was downhill from here. Her autumn collection was widely panned for its overuse of other designers' themes, including now Balenciaga, who had once licensed her work in Spain. Her new petite range was also received with unnoted fanfare, and by 1937, her work was actually booed for the first time upon the debut of Cocteau's Air de Perroir, for which she had designed the costumes. In 1938, despite No. 5 still performing phenomenally well, most of high-class Europe had distanced themselves from Chanel. When Chanel woke up to war on the 1st of September 1939, she closed her business. Bitter towards the workers who she blamed for the recent downturn, she wanted to punish them directly. Only the jewelry and the cosmetic divisions remained, and that's frankly because they weren't under her control. By 1940, Chanel was working with the Nazis. By 1944, she was arrested by the Allied forces for being a Nazi spy. She did nothing to hide her compliance during the war. However, her friends, Winston Churchill and the abdicated Edward VIII, intervened. She was released after 24 hours and self-exiled to Switzerland to protect her from the public, who now vehemently hated her. She began to pay off anyone with knowledge of her Nazi work, but in 1946 she was arrested again, this time with government knowledge of her Nazi identification number, F7124, her codename, Westminster, multiple letters written by her collaborator Vofferland, and the details of one of her spy missions, but not any of the others. But she got off again only because there was nothing written by her own hand. You may remember earlier I told you she was nigh illiterate. That's why there was nothing in her own hand. It's just the courts didn't know. By 1953, Chanel No. 5 global sales started to dip. It was the end of the Chanel brand. But while Pierre Wertheimer, the owner of the fragrance company, was more than willing for Chanel to run its course, Chanel was not. She re-established herself in the Ritz, sold her home in the south of France, sold all of her properties on the Rue Cambon, save for 31 Rue Cambon, and was in talks to begin a new ready-to-wear line in America called Coco Chanel, which she was going to use to fund the return of her couture. But Pierre wanted in. He offered Chanel to underwrite half of all of her expenses to ensure the return was even bigger than she could afford to do alone. And also subsequently, they quietly halted the ready-to-wear line for fear that it would overshadow the couture, or perhaps devalue the brand. Together, they embarked on a long period of marketing in anticipation of her return, heavily leaning on America, which is the one area where her reputation wasn't seriously damaged, drumming up as much interest as they possibly could. So, when the day finally came on the 5th of February 1954, every editor, buyer, client, and copyist was there with bated breath. One society lady come model after another paraded her famed staircase into the salon, and as they did, the audience's smiles fell. The show was a disaster. Nothing at Chanel had changed since before the war. She was as staid as they remembered from before. It was devastating. She had blown her chance at redemption. The failure was unignorable. But there was one glimmer of hope. America. While on her press tour, but pre-re-debut, Karl Snow promised that she and the entire Harper's Bazaar team would be happy to help Chanel in any way they could. This, given that it was during a time when Harper's Bazaar and Vogue were in fierce competition, led them to fight to say something positive about Chanel's return, even if it was majorly hyperbolically relayed. First Vogue, then Harper's Bazaar printed lavish spreads on Chanel, starting the rumor that Chanel rid women of corsets, which again, she did not, and most importantly, picking out the only new design in the entire new collection, which was the Chanel suit. American magazines saved Chanel that year, while Europe still widely hated her for her anti-Semitism and the way that she treated others. That was simply not known in America to the same extent, and so the gratuitous press and lack of negative press meant that she had just enough sales to scrape by. Just not anywhere close to profitably. Her return cost approximately 35 million French francs, which is the equivalent of about €1 million, $1.2 million, or £950,000 in 2025, and that far outweighed any profit accrued from sales. The company was in deep financial trouble once again, and she needed to be bailed out. She turned to the man that she had tried to destroy during the war, Pierre Wertheimer, the owner of Parfum Chanel. She sold Chanel Inc., her 10% stake in La Société de Parfum Chanel, her commercial properties, all investments bearing the Chanel name, such as subsidiaries, licensed goods, and even the license to the Chanel name, logo, and branding, in exchange for her living expenses being paid for the rest of her days. It was a very generous deal for Chanel, considering her expenses were astronomically high and her business was only propped up by a single fragrance. A fragrance which was continuing to lose steam. Quote, by the early 1960s, it was suffering from a potentially disastrous overexposure and was widely available throughout the United States in discount drugstores and at chain outlets like Woolworths. It was becoming associated with the kind of scent that was worn by an older generation of women who were out of step with fashion. Chanel herself grew even more bitter. It did not help her public perception. By the time Pierre Wertheimer died in 1963, nothing at Chanel had improved. The companies were succeeded by his son Jacques Wertheimer, but he famously didn't care about the business whatsoever, having his own distaste for a woman that actively tried to hurt his father. The turnaround of the company, or at least the cosmetics arm, was therefore not from Chanel nor from Jacques Wertheimer, but instead it was from a man who's rarely named in the history of Chanel but is so fundamental for their return, named Jacques Helou, who in 1965 was named Artistic Director of Fragrance and Beauty. It was his idea in 1968 to cast Catherine Deneuve, a French actress not really known internationally, as the face of the No. 5 fragrance. Her ads debuted in 1972 and were an incredible smash success both in France and America. This is really what set Chanel back on the path of growth, but you can decide whether it's a positive or a negative that Chanel never got to see her company return to a fragment of popularity as she herself died on the 10th of January 1971, the year before the ads debuted. In the wake of Chanel's death, there were a series of 4 artistic directors of fashion. Autumn-winter 1971 to spring-summer 1973 was Gaston Berthelot. He was Chanel's second-in-command, way before she died, and he saw placid reviews. Autumn-winter 1973 alone was Ramon Esparza, who came to Chanel following his mentor Balenciaga's 1972 death, and spring-summer 1974 to autumn-winter 1982 was Yvon Dudel and Jean Causebon, who received reviews that Chanel was still dull. It's also worth mentioning Philippe Guy Bourget, who began Chanel ready-to-wear in 1977 and produced 2 seasons to start, so spring-summer and autumn-winter ready-to-wear, and then the following year they also expanded that into spring advance and fall advance, which are like pre-collections, although they didn't fit on this diagram. However, of all of these designers, the one that's most worth discussing in this video, the one we cannot not talk about, is Ramon Esparza, who despite only having a single collection for the brand, was the only designer in all of this time to attempt to push Chanel in a new, youthful direction, as Jacques Helleux was doing at the fragrance end. Ramon Esparza showed humorous fashion with a bright blue Jaguar coat, a jacket with Fragile France embellished, sombrero-like shallow crown hats, and most importantly, the first example of the double C's ever used on clothing. The double C's were themselves invented in 1919 for the Capel Cup to commemorate Arthur Capel's death, and was first used publicly in 1924 on the Chanel No. 5 bottle. But this was the first time the logo was ever used on jewelry, buttons, or clothing, so it was neither Karl nor Chanel who invented this. You might find some online things that say Chanel used to put it on buttons. She did not, she used lions. Even the double C clasp on the Chanel flat bag, which is much later attributed to Karl, is not from Karl, it's from Esparza, as shown here. So he was a very, very influential designer to the history of Chanel, but at the time, the change was just too radical, and he was let go after one collection. Fun fact though, post Esparza, but before Dudel and Causebon, Lagerfeld was offered the position not once, but twice, turning it down both times, which ended up leaving the role to Dudel and Causebon in 1973, who again saw almost no positive reviews. No positive reviews at all. Everyone thought it was dull under them. As it was, Lagerfeld would only actually take up the position in 1982 after a very, very long period of courting from the brand, after which they offered him an open contract, a whopping $1 million in annual salary, which by the way is contested. I go over it in my book. There's a big long story before that. Also, he was offered unlimited budget for the collections, plus a $100,000 stipend for his friends. So frankly, it was money that convinced him to jump ship. It was a ridiculously huge jump from what he was offered at Chloé. But it wasn't that simple. Because of Chloé's contract, Lagerfeld would have to do a staggered entrance into the brand, starting with consultancy on a few different collections, moving on to couture in spring-summer 83, and then ready-to-wear for autumn-winter 83, all of which were immediately seen as huge successes for contemporizing the codes of Chanel with the use of denim and leather, removing the podium stage, and debuting the younger skewing fragrance Coco, although that really is more attributed to Jacques Helleux. From here, Karl Lagerfeld's Chanel can be broken down into about 4 eras. 1983 to 1990 is what I'm calling the debut. He set about creating brand signatures for Chanel for the first time. translating things that Chanel herself used but hadn't established yet as themes within the brand. This includes heavy use of tweed, marketing the gold trim in the jackets, heavy use of pearls, the black and beige leitmotif, using leather detailing, reintroducing the La Marie Camellia, which Chanel did herself commission many years before, the Mazzaro two-tone shoes, and finally using military-inspired elements such as epaulettes. He also would work in Ramon Esparza-inspired elements, which he was never given the opportunity to develop into themes, including the use of adding very colourful pieces in between the black and the beige, which geared it towards a younger audience. He returned the use of using the double C logo in clothing, and he also brought back humorous elements as well, which Karl now reinterpreted into trompe-l'oeil from his first collection. Karl was a master of provenance in this manner, and even introduced to the brand the necessity of a Chanel archive. Because of this, his vision for Chanel completely reinstated the brand to popularity throughout this time, going to great lengths with the Wertheimers, who had begun this campaign at least as far back as 1981 with the movie Chanel Solitaire, to use marketing to reframe Chanel as this genius designer who was monumental in freeing women. Of course, having watched this video, you know that's not even close to the case at all, as she was actually much more talented at translating trends into her own branded minimalist style. But the marketing worked wonders, and that's why we think Chanel was more innovative than she actually was. Also, that's not really a dig. Karl similarly had no personalized style of design and instead is really famed for translating design styles into a modern context. It's what makes them both successful at their craft. Regardless, it was a massive success. Chanel's memory was quickly reframed, and Chanel was transformed from being a very widely disliked Nazi-affiliated brand to one that was young and fresh, most famously evidenced by the legendarily great success of the Chanel double flap bag, which debuted in autumn-winter 83 ready to wear. The next era under Karl is about 1990 to 1999, in which I'm calling the four-pronged approach. This is because the marketing of the Chanel brand can really be broken down into four different categories. The first prong of which is the use of supermodels within their fashion shows. Though this tactic really began definitely in 1983 with the signing of Inès de la Fressange to an exclusive contract, it really became popular around 1990 and would continue to gain traction throughout this decade with popular models like Stella Tennant, Linda Evangelista, Claudia Schiffer, and Kristen McMenemy. Simultaneously to this, Chanel began to expand, firstly vertically by buying up their couture suppliers to save them from bankruptcy. They bought far more companies than you would ever believe from 1985 onwards, so many that I had to give them their own chapter within the book because there was that many, and it's several pages long, by the way. But by the 1990s, that would actually become a real strategy for the brand to basically monopolize the couture crafts across the world. This was expanded in 1996 to create Parafection, which housed their non-consumer facing acquisitions. And secondly, they also expanded horizontally when they bought a 70% stake in Isaac Mizrahi, though that lost them about $70 million by 1995, and they pulled the plug in 1998, which ended up completely crashing the company. I don't think he ever recovered from this. The interesting thing about this, however, is that we didn't know Chanel owned 70% of Isaac Mizrahi until he sued them a couple of years down the line because it was brought through one of their subsidiaries. He lost the court case, so Chanel do still own the brand and its branding, but it raises the question of if Chanel have since expanded horizontally with other businesses that we just don't know that they've acquired. The third prong of this strategy was shock marketing. Not quite in the brutal way that you probably know from Vivienne Westwood, John Galliano, or Alexander McQueen, but it was still the same strategy nonetheless, starting with hiring Philip Tracy to create a giant birdcage hat for autumn-winter 91 couture, and going on to have so many more iconic moments throughout the decade. And the fourth prong has to do with the cosmetic side of the business, again Jacques Helleux, because he was simultaneously making that side more youthful as well, thanks to the 1990 advert for Egoist, several in-store advances, which again I go over in the book, as well as the old video from Underskin. I really do recommend that video, it still holds up, and their 1999 skincare line Precision. Sorry I couldn't go into any of those 4 prongs in a bit more detail, but there was too much to say, so I really whittled it down. Let me know if you'd be interested in a dedicated Karl's era at Chanel video, and I will go over this in much more detail in that when I have, more time to do so. The third era under Karl is 2000 to about 2013, in which I'm calling self-preservation. Because during the 1990s, Chanel was really on the up and up. But by 1998, their design aesthetic and their marketing approach was noted to be not having changed since about 1983, and the public was bored. Quote, "Having brought Chanel so brilliantly to life, the fashion cycle is again relegating the label to bourgeois bore." This led him to creating a minimal collection in spring-summer 1999, which was exceptionally widely panned for departing from the known Chanel aesthetic. He was between a rock and a hard place. Modernize the brand, get bad reviews. Keep the classics, get bad reviews. So instead, these next 5 years became about self-preservation, proving he could successfully revitalize the company for a second time by doubling down on this new minimal Chanel aesthetic. He started advertising online, he hired Peter Marino to redo the stores, launched a swimwear line called Moonlight, lowered prices across Chanel, promoted sportswear and casual wear, shrinking the logo in size. He debuted an advert on MTV, was heavily featured in Sex and the City. They started a new diffusion line called Beige for entry-level products, and there was also a huge marketing campaign towards younger people, as well as a new freestanding Chanel shoe shop in Paris. However, while all of that effort was going towards a younger audience, he couldn't do that while ignoring the original clientele. So instead, he decided to expand the cruise collections to catwalk shows beginning May 2000, which began a whole new era for Chanel, which in my book I'm calling Spectacular Chanel, as from this point, the sets and the locations would be used as the shock marketing factor, while they would settle on shows that were approximately 60% classic and 40% new styles to find the perfect blend of everything that everyone had been asking for. By February 2003, this had already expanded into the new Métier d'Art show, which was part trade show for other couture houses, part publicity stunt to show off the talents in their acquired businesses. It improved brand perception across the board and became a mainstay from here on out, joining the ready-to-wear, couture and cruise collections in their growth over the next decade. And with that, he had succeeded in bringing Chanel from extinction once again by 2003 and seeing another decade of prosperity, materialized by the 2011 release of the Boy bag, which became another cash cow for the company. This brings us to the fourth era of Karl, from 2013 to 2019, which I'm calling the dip, but that might be a little unfair. You see, in 2013, Karl Lagerfeld released his book, The World According to Karl, and in it, his quote, "Sweatpants are a sign of defeat. You lost control of your life, so you bought some sweatpants," was well repeated in the media. It was the start of a very slow decline in his personal public popularity that also came to affect how Chanel was perceived. Spring-summer 15 especially was quite famed for this, as they saw a lot of pushback for their feminism collection, which people thought was dishonest for Karl's statements in the press, of which his criticisms of the way Michelle Obama looked had also gone viral by this point, but also because Chanel herself was well known to be a Nazi by this point, and it brought up her collaboration again. In France specifically, it also saw a resurgence of her reputation for treating staff appallingly, which the reputation has seemingly continued until this point, but I don't think it caught much traction outside of France. In that sense, Chanel's refusal to come onto social media, even by just this point, didn't help at all because it was giving the impression that while they were doing all of these performative things, they weren't listening to the public opinion about why that probably wasn't a good idea. So, with the boredom of style once again being a problem, Karl's personal controversies, and a fall in quality beginning around 2008 when they removed the 24-karat gold plating on bags, as well as a large annual price increase almost year on year, Chanel again began to fall from favor. Quote, in 2016, Chanel suffered a fall in sales and profits according to the figures filed with Amsterdam Chamber of Commerce by International BV, the Dutch holding company which controls the luxury fashion label and its subsidiaries. As in 2015, creative director Karl Lagerfeld saw its net income plummet by 34.8%, down to 874 million, or 736 million euros, while its revenue lost 9%, reaching $5.67 billion, or 4.77 billion euros. Operating income was also down in 2016, falling by 20% to $1.28 billion, or 1.07 billion euros. As for Chanel's I nearly got that in one breath. Okay. As for Chanel's net profit margin, it dropped to 15.4%, compared to 21.5% in 2015. Public sentiment soon grew so large that the Wertheimers felt forced to release the Chanel full-year earnings for the first time ever in June 2018, which did help somewhat, but it was a bit too little too late. The criticisms had begun literally a decade before, and I've said it once and I will say it again, the truth doesn't matter. Our perception of the truth is what matters. So for them to have just let us believe that Chanel was falling in quality and all of these other things for the last decade, whether it was true or not, it hurt their business. Unfortunately for Chanel, it was at this low point that Lagerfeld would succumb to his illness when he passed away on the 19th of February 2019. His successor was named almost immediately and had been well prepped for the role, thanks to Karl knowing that he was unwell for several years before this. In fact, she had even taken a bow with Karl for the Cruise 2019 show, so well before his departure, it was obvious that she would take over. That did not, however, mean that her debut was a success. Unfortunately for Virginie, all of the issues that Chanel had had before were now on her shoulders. But she didn't have the decades-long reputation on which to quell any worries. As such, when her designs, and her sets for that matter, were just a continuation of what the public was already complaining about, she didn't really stand a chance. Complaints of fit, of a dated style, of a lack of quality were all rife across platforms. From this debut onwards, the reviews never picked up, and even other major changes at Chanel House that should have been reported on positively, for example, the 19 which was a massive central hub Chanel built for their Métier d'Art members that opened in January 2022, was barely mentioned in the media at all in place of negative reporting on Viard's style, so she never really stood a chance. On the 5th of June 2024, Virginie Viard announced that she was stepping down from the role, mostly to a positive reception. Earlier this year, I actually met Virginie at the Stella McCartney Autumn Winter 25 show just by chance, and I did manage to ask her how she was doing. And she looked grateful for the question, but assured me that she was doing well, and I am glad for that. The media wasn't exactly kind to Virginie while she was at the head of the brand, and I know it's her job to be the face of the company, but it's very likely that she had been given the role without any freedom to change anything whatsoever. The company was profitable at that time, and they undoubtedly would have been looking to minimize risk. That's why she was chosen in the first place, because Karl chose her. It was less risk, and that's why she likely had to keep to a strict design allowance. Unfortunately for Viard, she was placed at the helm of the brand that had long been seen not to listen to its customers. So when Virginie debuted and continued with collections that were also unchanged, she was dealt the lion's share of the blame. This is ultimately why she was allegedly fired and why she supposedly did not show up for her final collection, which was Autumn Winter 24 Couture, that showed only 20 days after she left. It's also likely why the interim 5 collections before her successor were similarly unchanged and similarly negatively reviewed. It's this Chanel in which Matthieu Blazy has now found himself at the helm. As of writing, Blazy has yet to debut at the House of Chanel. This video was intended to coincide with his debut, so I thought it best to write up until this point in order to allow that backstory that Blazy was coming into and allow for Blazy to settle in before I give, a real review about his Chanel. I'll put his debut show on the screen for you to see because I'm almost certain to say without having seen the show that reviews will be mixed. It's incredibly difficult of a job to blend classic and contemporary in a way that pleases both audiences. And frankly, for Chanel, much more so than any other brands, their legacy is how they define the brand. It's why we all perceive the brand to have so much value still, despite factors like their falling quality and raised price and their alleged not making any profits, which does seem to be false. For this reason, that's why there has been so much discourse around if Blazy is the correct replacement at the brand. But one thing is for sure, is that much like Chanel and much like Lagerfeld, his CV, which I'll put on screen, is littered with quite varying design roles of which he's been hired during major moments in design history. Because, in that sense, he does have the same quality that Chanel and Lagerfeld had that made Chanel successful in the past. He was able to translate maximalism and deconstruction at Margiela, practical women's wear at Celine, Americana at 205W39 NYC, and a modern, timeless elegance at Bottega Veneta. Further to that, his ability to continue the same client base that Daniel Lee focused on at Bottega Veneta shows that he is able to transition from a previous designer's work to his own take in a seamless manner, in the same way that heads of Chanel obviously hope that he is able to do for them. Of course, only time will tell if this iteration of the brand will find the same longevity that Lagerfeld had. And at least, because I know that we as the public are so quick to judge, I do hope that we give him the grace time to grow into the role before we start pummeling him with all of our reviews. Because one thing is for sure, all eyes will be on Chanel and Matthieu Blazy from here on out. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you did like the video, please do hit the like button and the subscribe button. For videos just like this, but about beauty brands, including that Chanel Cosmetics video I really do recommend you watch, click here. And special thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon for their ongoing support and for waiting such a long time for this video. There's so much reading went into this, there was a big gap. So thank you very much for your patience on that one. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.